Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. Today, what it costs to move around. We're going to stay away from airlines, at least directly. We did that last week. But today, the food bill, the cost of filling the tank, the growing burden of higher mortgages, and coming soon, a new carbon tax. Not the one that was upped on April 1st, but now one that's coming at you July 1st. It's called the Clean Fuel Standard, the CFS. And that will be your July 1st. Happy Canada Day, folks, for that. We also want to look at the impact of OPEC cutting production and some of the bills that we've seen going back and forth in the House of Commons and the Senate, and to see what that means for our farmers who were looking for some relief. Where we turn at this occasion is Dan McTeague, president of Canadians for Affordable Energy, a former Liberal member of Parliament, and you will be surprised, I think, when you hear some of his comments today that he once held that job. And you know him on Twitter. I think it's still at Gas Price Wizard. Is that your handle? Welcome. Great to see you.
Good to be here, Senator Wallin. Thanks for having me.
Can we just start with the, I don't know, carbon tax 2.0, what are we going to call it? The clean fuel standard? I don't know. It's a tax, isn't it?
It's a tax. It's a burden. It's a move to reduce emissions by emitters. That is to say, get CO2 out by some 15% of current production by 2030. And they, in fact, don't even call it the clean fuel standard anymore. They've changed it to clean fuel regulation. Actually, what they should have done is just call it a fuel regulation, because Canada has already achieved clean fuel, like it or not. The emissions on vehicles are record low. Internal combustion engines, produce, a fifth to a tenth of the smog that they once did. So you don't hear smog days caused by cars anymore, unless, of course, it's coming from the United States.
So what is this going to mean? They talk about the carbon intensity that they're trying to deal with. And I've heard it explained a couple of ways. So let's go over it. That they're kind of increasing the ethanol content, which I read to be, I'm going to get lower mileage or lower bang for my buck per gallon of gas liter.
Well, let's put this in context, Senator Wallin. We have a situation where you're telling refineries that in 5 to 10 years, you don't want them in the business of producing gasoline or diesel or jet fuel. Good luck with that, but I'll deal with that a little later on. Yeah. So you're basically saying to refineries, we want you now to cut your emissions 15% from where they are today, and we want you to do this by 2030. Refineries who say, look, there's an easy way to do this in the short term, will achieve half of that by blending more ethanol into gasoline. Right now, the national mandate, there is no national mandate, but it's between 5 and 10%, depending on the province. Now it is going to be pretty clear that across the board, I say with the exception of Vancouver and British Columbia, because they have their own low carbon fuel standard, and that's where you'll see how much it's going to cost. We already have the template right in front of us. But they're all going to go in that direction. For the next 2 years, you're going to see ethanol increase in terms of mileage. Ethanol is not like gasoline. It doesn't have the same properties, doesn't have the density, doesn't have the same energy, and therefore you're going to see a hit on your mileage. You're going to go travel further or pay more to go do the same travel you did before, which is ironic, because it now means that those on the road using the same vehicle are going to have to use more gasoline with ethanol in it to do what they once did. And so that's very counterintuitive, but that's the way refineries are going to do it for the next 2 years. After that, they're going to the carbon credit market, that unregulated, Wild West market in which carbon credits are $400 to $600, somewhere in that range. That's anywhere from 17 to 30 cents a liter between now and 2025 and 2030.
This whole system of credits is always, to me, a bit of well, I'm not going to say a joke because it's very concerning, but, Al Gore or the prime minister or whoever it is jets around the world all of the time. And as long as they can get a credit from some other location or some other country that isn't even rich enough to have cars, somehow it's okay.
Some members of my family are in the farming business, and we're approached by a company, I won't mention it, saying, hey, listen, if you're not plowing your field the next couple of years, would you mind offering it as a carbon credit? So, sure, what are you going to give me? A couple $100? No, a few thousand. This is really jiggery pokery, and it does not compute. You're basically saying, hey, listen, if something is not producing or emitting, therefore you can use that as an offset. I call it what it is, an indulgence. You get to pay a bit of money in order to pretend that you're not doing these things. If look, the debate should be whether we believe this will happen or not. So far, the evidence is where governments believe they can get to decarbonization. Kind of a scary thought when you think about it, because everything we have, our life form is carbon. But if we can get to 2050 net zero carbon, no one in their right mind is saying we can achieve that. In fact, the latest reports today are saying just that. It's an illusion. I tend to think that maybe you should just leave carbon alone and start dealing with the other stuff, but that's digressing. I think at this point, what's critical is to understand that to get to that is going to cost Canadians far more than they could ever possibly imagine in their fondest dreams or nightmares.
Well, and I guess that's one of the issues too, which is, the headlines you read is that we simply don't have enough lithium or cobalt or all of the components for batteries, so that we're all using EV cars to even get there in the next couple of decades. It's just not ready for prime time, and we don't have a strategy or rules that will allow mining to even accelerate to accomplish this.
So Washington, not too long ago, and it was ironic that the officials there told me that the Canadian government is telling them they can get a mine approved in 3 years or less. That's news to me, and it's news to a lot of Canadians and those in the industry. But if you believe that you can have a mine and do all these wonderful things and operate without the use of diesel, without the use of power machines, mechanics, the work that needs to go into creating and producing, the amount of energy required cannot be done by simply, running a windmill in your backyard or on top of a hill or near a rock pile. The reality is that to do these things is going to require a lot more intense energy, and it's on products that we normally don't extract without some significant environmental impacts. No, by the way, when it comes to those stockpiles of lithium, those stockpiles of cobalt, those stockpiles, we might have them in the ground, but the means of processing to a large extent is owned by the Chinese.
Yeah, that's the other big issue. And then when I read that headline, it makes me crazy too, that China's emissions exceed all of the developed nations combined. So until they clean up their act, we can keep on driving this direction, but it's not going to have the impact that everybody wants.
Well, when you have the kind of commentary by the previous Environment Minister, Catherine McKenna, go around saying China's doing great things on emissions, and that being, an absolute bald-faced lie, either you're ill-informed or you're trying to prove something which doesn't exist. I think that we need to have a bit of a setback, or sort of a step back on all of this and say, listen, this is where we want to go. This is how we're going to achieve it. We're not going to do it because of platitudes and people trying to be trendy and jumping on jets, flying to, Davos to swill back Perrier and eat canapes. This is far more serious, and it's now starting to have an impact on a country with the third largest provable reserves in the world at a time in which the country with the eighth largest oil provable reserves in the world has got Europe and the rest of the world in its hand.
Yeah. Okay, let's go through some of these issues because first, I think I want to ask you about OPEC, because a couple of weeks back they were cutting production. Is that going to have any impact on the price at the pumps?
Oh, it is going to have an impact. It's a matter of when. Right now, you have a mindset among traders, and many of those traders are operating based on platforms of artificial intelligence. They're based on hedgers. They're based on short traders, those who can make money by dumbing down a product. And as we've seen with meme stocks, we won't go down that whole road, but we saw that with AMC and a few others, GameStop. My concern here is that OPEC's view is that North America and Europe have to be left on their own. And to a large extent, North America has been salvaged by the use of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the ability to raise the capacity on existing rail and pipelines to get much needed energy, in particular heavier products and natural gas throughout North America. So that's been a bit of a blessing. The Americans, of course, have beat us on the LNG. We had 17 projects. One, it might be completed someday in the next few years. They've been able to build 4, and they have another 3 planned to roll out pretty soon. They've used that to help Europe, who also benefited. Talk about horseshoes. had a very, very warm winter. Thank goodness that happened. But I think the full effect of what OPEC is doing hasn't been understood because we're seeing a supply crunch. We're not replacing the spare barrels that we're losing, even with Iran coming on and hoping that Venezuela will produce a few more barrels of oil. The reality is that the world has changed. The global supply structure has changed dramatically, focusing countries like Russia and its delivery of oil and natural gas to Asia and to the middle parts of that continent. The reality is that for now, Canada's sitting on the sidelines, and it shouldn't, despite the requests by the Japanese Prime Minister and the German chancellors that we help. We see no business case, even though it's obvious to everybody else.
Yeah, the LNG, that was I think shocking to a lot of people, that here we are, one of the world's leading producers of energy, and we had no capacity to step up and help our allies, never mind Ukraine. The other thing that Germany pointed out, or made clear to all of us, is that having shut down all their nuclear plants, you can't actually get to any greener state if you don't have that. We're going to need that in a reduced carbon environment.
So $500 billion later, and they're now burning more coal than any time in their history, and they're in doing so, they're muscling out countries in the world that still rely on coal. They're developing, Africa in particular. You want to do something for the third world and development of nations that are trying to develop. The last thing you want to do is to take a mainstay in their economic opportunity, an important feedstock, and drive up that price because you've got your fanaticism, your belief in clean energy so spectacularly wrong.
The promise that we heard, I'm old enough to remember this now, that we've heard ministers over the last 8 years say, we're not going to hike the carbon tax. The carbon tax increases will be minimal. They will be very small. No, you won't have to change your standard of living. The message seems to be changing, both in reality about the price of fuel seriously going up. And I think you've crunched the numbers on that, at least for Eastern Canada. And then the whole question about what it means in terms of, whether we're going to have to survive wearing sweaters all winter. But walk me through the prices, the price impact and the numbers you've done, I know, in the East.
Well, we know the CFS is going to have an impact, short term and long term, and there's other factors we can't consider. But the existing carbon tax is only supposed to go to $50, $50 a ton, which is 11 cents a liter, plus HST or GST. It's now slated to go to 37 cents a liter, 38 cents a liter, and from there, with HST, have that second carbon tax added to it. The net effect, which will be 75 cents a liter, plus tax sooner or later by 2030. Now, some say, 2030 is way down the road. Hey, it's 6.5 years and we're there. That's not that long. So now I can be qualified in 75 to 78 months. We're going to be in an intolerable situation, which is now starting to cascade throughout the economy. And let me make that really clear, because I've had a couple of economists try to argue this point. They try to, suggest the math is incorrect. If I'm a farmer and I have to pay a carbon tax on drying my grain, I have to pay for carbon tax on planting, I have to pay a carbon tax on shipping, processing, delivery. At every point, that adds another percent. By the time it's all said and done, from field to fork, we're looking at not a 10% carbon tax on fuel, or what amounts to a 10% hit to fuel. We're talking maybe as much as 18, 19%. So therein lies the rub. And it's amazing. It's mind-boggling that the Bank of Canada, which is fighting inflation, isn't prepared to see something as important as energy and energy prices being driven up artificially, not having an impact on driving up inflation, which they are in turn responding to by raising interest rates. So maybe it's just me.
No, but they've already conceded that this is going to slow economic growth. I mean, we've heard that directly from the Bank of Canada. So they know the impact is there. But it doesn't seem to, they're not calling for it to slow or to stop.
Well, their priority should be on focusing on monetary policy rather than planting trees, shouldn't it? I'm not being flippant. This astounds me. Look, my first break on Parliament Hill was in 1981-82. I worked for a guy named Paul Cosgrove. He was Minister of Housing when we saw 22%. People having mortgages of $100,000 were bankrupt. They were coming to our constituency office and throwing their keys and saying, I'm living in the station wagon now, thanks to you guys. Everybody was affected by that. We're now heading towards 7-8% interest rates with people with $1 million mortgages. And so for that reason, I think we have to take more care on this. And I'm most concerned about not just the impact on energy as a cost of fuel and transportation, but now the cost of manufacturing. Is this a disincentive to manufacture in Canada? And ultimately, the cost of food. Nobody in this country can deny that food prices have risen, but nobody can accept the argument that somehow it's an international phenomenon. It's a made-at-home problem, aggravated, exacerbated by the only country I know in the world that has 2 carbon taxes.
No, and you, like, I live in a community of farmers. I mean, they will walk you through this with the numbers, chapter and verse, what the carbon tax means. They have to heat barns. They have to dry grain if there's rain at the wrong moment, literally. And you have farmers almost in tears saying, it has always been our mission, as it was my father's and my grandfather's before me, to feed not only Canada, but the world. And we're being told we shouldn't do that, that we're not going to let you do that because it's going to be too expensive.
Well, Haber-Bosch came up with a very interesting design, unfortunately, in the First World War, but it was to use nitrogen to increase the output of crops and to stave off the naysayers and the doomsday sayers who said that the population would explode and that we would all starve. That didn't work out so well. And so, the naysayers and the doomsday cult really have not much to find, except now they're finding a way to destroy the very thing that has been the vanguard of Canadian prosperity and which has been very much at the core, the centerpiece of our ability to live and coexist and to live long, prosperous lives. If that's what they're really proposing, and then saying, if you don't believe us, look at the bad weather, then I think we're being sold what amounts to a bill of goods on a major scale that I would consider nothing short of intellectual fraud. And for that reason, I think it's important to push back on this, because when I first heard this proposed back in my time as a young lad working in the Liberal Party for a candidate named Maurice Strong, I'm kind of used to this. He got it wrong then. He would have it wrong today. God rest his soul. But the reality is that I've heard this, and I've heard it time and time again. If people are so negative on humanity and on people living, then stop making these doomsday scenario that the world would end. Greta Thunberg got it wrong, obviously. We were supposed to all be gone and extinct 2 days ago after her 5-year prediction.
We survived again. I'm always puzzled, and I want to go through this because it's interesting to me that even the approach on the doomsday scenarios and the rhetoric and forcing companies into kind of, as you say, contrived green behavior. People care about the environment. Of course we do. We all have family and kids, and we don't want to live in what Beijing used to look like, with air so thick you could cut it with a knife. I mean, we all want to keep the environment as pristine as we can. The oil sector is working on that. The agriculture sector is working on that. What is the incentive to say the lifestyle that we have achieved with vehicles that get us through winter and from point A to point B, and houses that are warm in the winter and cool in the summer? What would motivate us to say, no more of that? You have to give that up. And for all those people in the developing world, they're not even going to get a crack at it so that they can give it up. We're going to stop it before it happens. What are we trying to achieve?
I think to a large extent it is control over populations. I'm not speaking from a perspective of, a conspiracy theory or anything like that, but, you want to control behavior because you believe that behavior to be, in and of itself, bad. I'm sure there is some behavior out there that isn't great, but I, as a kid growing up in Toronto, used to go down to Lake Ontario and I couldn't see. I could almost walk across it. It was so filled with pollution and dead fish and smell and stink and stench and everything else. And there were water quality issues along with that as well. Look, it's not good enough to sit on our laurels and say, hey, aren't we great? But I think
nobody's saying that.
Yeah, the narrative is different. It's as if we're all bad. The things we've done are terrible. Everything's rotten. We haven't done a very good job teaching young people history and to understand the great privations that exist in this country. As growing up in a French family, the old comments of Molière saying Canada being nothing more than quelques arpents de neige et bancs de fléau, nothing more than a few snowbanks and bad snowdrifts. That, to me, is what Canada was referred to for many years, and we've conquered that. We've been able to overcome that, and we've been able to attract people to a great nation with prosperity. And by the way, it doesn't mean just oil and gas. I was a member of Parliament in Pickering that had the first commercial North American nuclear reactors. Long before it's trendy to talk about decarbonization, we were doing it. And, got no, look, I think we have some ideas and all those things will come along. But I don't think setting imaginary deadlines in the sand, net zero 2030, net zero 2050, just transition to build back better, all these things. That's political sloganeering. It has nothing to do with the reality. I think Canadians more and more appreciate and should, if they haven't, begin to appreciate a little bit of our history.
Well, let's take a look at that, because we just got the latest version of the just transition, or the Sustainable Jobs Bill. The name keeps changing. I don't think just transition was very successful. And interestingly, I've got the words here of the CEO of Cenovus, who said, decarbonizing oil sands could create a jobs boom in Alberta. Is that possible?
Well, if he's talking sequestration, I think there's, large companies don't want to be caught in the deer in the proverbial headlights. They don't want to be run over by this. At the same time, they've got to find their spine, and they have to find their footing soon. At the end of the day, those pushing decarbonization want them out of business. And there's no way around it. Creating fossil fuels, which of course produces everything that we take for granted. The glasses that I'm wearing, the video that you and I are talking about, everything around it is ubiquitous, and it could not exist without fossil fuels. So companies like that are trying to mollify, I hate to use the word appease, are going to find that at the end of the day, this will not be enough. And so sooner or later, they're going to have to stand up and push back. And by the way, Senator Wallin, when I was a member of Parliament, I went after them on competition issues, on gasoline, and on companies snuffing out small independent retailers. Energy sector took me on. They never backed off. Where did that kind of resolve go? And I think it's not up to me, a guy from Ontario who predicts gas prices, ticks them off by $50 million a year in those predictions and the money they lose. They need to stand up and push back and say, what you're asking for is a recipe for disaster, and it is a suicide note for civilization, and you damn well know it.
The sense that you have when I go home and I talk to people about the just transition, or whether it's bills 234 on the break for farmers, you're hearing the argument now, which is, this whole approach is the National Energy Plan 2.0.
It is.
Dad set out to kill the energy sector way back when in the 80s, and son is going to finish the job. Even the degree of truth to that statement may or may, you could debate it, but it's what people now feel in my part of the world. They feel under attack by the government of the country.
Well, it's a government of country whose, primary basis of support is, those with decent pensions, decent civil servant jobs, and in urban areas across the country. I know I represented it for 18 years. But I don't think that's ubiquitous. I think outside of the big smoke, there is pushback. Places in Ontario where I know that this is a grave concern. The concern of farmers in Western Canada is no different than farmers in Eastern Canada. Okay. And so these costs are costs that they have to pass on. Many respects they cannot. And there are pressures as to whether or not generation after generation will survive. The just transition is a solution to a problem created by the Trudeau government itself. This is about their own false narrative. It is about their own false policies. They're basically saying, hey, listen, we can take everybody who's working, making decent jobs, producing a product that the world desperately wants, and don't take our word for it. As I mentioned earlier, the Chancellor of Germany, the Japanese Prime Minister begged to give us some more. If we want to get rid of that, that's fine. But the reality is, I think for a lot of people, this is just a little too much. And where are we going to borrow the money when you've despoiled, as I called it the other day, it's like a dog despoiling its kennel. When you've destroyed the ability for that industry and that sector to raise the tens of billions of dollars that the federal, provincial, municipal governments cash in every year, How are you going to pay for jobs, artificial jobs, or jobs that you want to create, and create the kind of economic heft that will sustain our standard of living? The fact is, you won't, and they know it. If they want to, you pull them aside personally, they'll tell you this is not going to work.
You ask any premier in this country of whatever political stripe, and they will tell you without the revenues from the oil and gas sector, there's no health care. There's no social program structure. There's no daycare for kids. Like, this is a huge generator of income for governments and services for Canadians.
Absolutely. And no pensions for teachers. It's important to say that. I come from a family of a lot of teachers, and they don't like when you say it, but it's true. And if you don't have, what is going to attract money into Canada? You look at the Canadian dollar, 133 pennies to buy a US dollar. There's nothing attracting money into Canada, save and except the housing boom, which of course is just that, a bubble. And it may very well burst for reasons that are well beyond the scope of the discussion. But make no mistake, I think we're playing with fire here. And I think Canadians have got to realize and wake up that this is not by accident that they're seeing their standard of living significantly diminished in the government's attempt to try to destroy an industry that is really very much the golden goose of the nation.
I know your views are very strong about this, and you're being very tempered in your remarks today. Is it fair to say that the oil and gas sector, I see it more closely in agriculture, really is doing its part to clean up its act and reduce emissions? Are they really doing it?
I'm not a rah-rah of the industry. I have no connections to it. I'm probably its biggest or one of its few irritants, and I have been for 25 years or so. So my view on this is that I've never thought that in my wildest dreams we would be seeking to kill the industry as opposed to correcting its behavior. That was on the competition side. You now have an industry that, based on the infamous scale of environmental, social, and governance, produces a barrel of crude that is considered the highest ranking of any nation producing oil in the world today. So you think about that for a moment and say, well, look at our output. Is it great? If you're going to measure things by methane, by emissions, they're getting their act together, and they're doing it in a way that's responsible, not just to the environment, but also responsible to human rights, to dignity, to labor. These are high-paying jobs. These are the things that create 8,000 to 10,000 jobs in my province, not to mention the billions of dollars in economic activity, without which the province of Ontario would go bankrupt. And let's not forget equalization for a moment.
Yeah.
Okay. Because anybody who thinks you can simply walk away, this equalization goes beyond the issue of governments into the issue of helping people. You talked about programs earlier. If we're prepared to kill this particular golden goose, as I referred to earlier, I think we have to have a serious adult discussion about what it's going to mean for every person on a dollar basis. You like your home? You like your cost of living? You like your job? Well, think about those now being compromised. We got a government that doesn't know what it's doing.
And when you take that into the ag sector, and we mentioned this briefly, just, the demand to reduce the use of fertilizer through emission controls, again, that is a standard of living issue. I mean, yes, food inflation is high at this point, but we have food in this country and plenty to sell and share.
Do we want to go back to the 1850s and homesteading? Yeah. That's what we're saying.
Yeah.
Look, if you think that going out and using animal renderings or whatever to produce manure is somehow going to displace the significance of nitrogen, urea, and potash, if you think that that's going to happen, then folks, I would expect there to be a lot of very skinny people in this country in the next 6 months, because there is not the ability to do the things that we're doing. The production and yield per acre in this country is exceptional. I don't think it's well understood yet. I think some segments of the economy and the farm community is starting to get it, and I hope they're not going to play one off against the other. But you're seeing what's happened in Holland, what you're seeing in Europe is going to happen in Canada, and there will be a pushback. It's very interesting. I'm here in Toronto, but you see a lot of those no farmers, no food, or farmers feed cities. That was a big slogan, and I think Canadians get that, especially on every person today who's going to a grocery store. Don't complain about when you go in. Look at that grocery bill. Pick up an old one that you had a year or two ago and say to yourself, is this possible? It's not sustainable.
One of the discussions that I have, and it comes up on many issues. Certainly, energy is one, agricultural is one, gun control is another. Is the kind of the urban rural divide where people who live in cities, and I understand it. If you live in downtown Toronto, crime is bad. Guns, that's an issue. Let's deal with them. That'll stop the crime. It's a simplistic view, but I get it from that perspective. You try and make the case that farmers have other issues and other reasons to deal with guns. It's the basic stuff like cars. When an environment minister in Ottawa tells me to ride my bike to work, and I try to explain that I can't even fly the 3,000 kilometers because we can't get the airlines functioning either. But this is not something that I can do. There's no charging stations. EVs don't work in temperatures that I deal with, which is -40 and -50 for weeks on end, not an odd day. Is there just some fundamental misunderstanding that, and if that's true, which I believe, is there any bridge?
We've lost the words diversity and consensus in our political nomenclature. I came from a party that used to be Big Tent and worked hard and had a very, very strong presence in rural Canada. I mean, going back well before my time to the days of George Brown and others. So these were important milestones in the development of my party. Again, I'm sure that the cult of new Liberal MPs and the collection of new Liberal MPs aren't quite familiar with the depth with which our party was able to surround itself with the idea of building consensus and trying to govern a country that had a variety of views and different opinions. And it wasn't just divisions on religion and language and on region. It was far more complex than that. And yet we cobbled together a great nation in which all voices were heard, or at least had a place to be heard. And when they weren't, they were addressed. We surrendered that for divide and conquer. And I don't say politically, but also in terms of our own, we don't think much closer than our 15-minute cities. We don't think much closer than where we are. I suspect that the biggest problem with Canadians today is that they take far too much for granted. And that's owing to the fact that prosperity has made us dumb in the sense of ignorance and has made us completely oblivious to what makes this nation function.
So who wants to stand up and have that conversation? That I think that's part of the problem. That everybody thinks there's a political price. The Prime Minister is now starting to get a lot of pressure from the left on not going far enough, fast enough. And from the other side of the coin saying, hold on, our way of life is at stake here. We're not prepared to forfeit that this morning.
I'm not sure how to answer that, except to say that sooner or later the debt bond rating agencies are going to have to come in and settle the matter for us. I recall vividly these problems that beset Paul Martin and Jean Cadet in 1995 to 1997, where we were going to be the honorary member of the IMF if we didn't get our financial house in order. It's good to clamor for you wanting more and more spending, but if you're willing to cut off the ability for the country to generate the revenue so that you can have all these wonderful programs, then I think you have to get real and you have to get smart. Because if you don't think that there's a connection between the two, you ought not to be making those opinions. You're free to make an opinion. I just don't think it should be taken very seriously. I think the left and the right have run their course. There is no one speaking for Canada from coast to coast. There are people who are looking at cute ways to provide policies that divide. I refer to the CFS or the CFR, the Clean Fuel Standard, as the National Energy Program 2.0. I've been saying that for months. I believe that that's the wrong approach to take, and that we have to build this by consensus. And at the end of the day, it's not going to work out well. It takes only a few more Canadians to fall below the waterline. A few more Canadians winding up at food banks in a country that is given to with the riches that we have before you'll hit a tipping point. And that tipping point is very, very near if it isn't already at hand.
Dan, thank you very much. Thanks for your time today and for this discussion. I think we do need to have a grown-up adult conversation right across this country. Thanks.
I appreciate the time. Thanks for having me, Senator Wallin.
Dan McTeague, President of the Canadians for affordable energy. And as you've heard him explain, a former Liberal member of Parliament, he knows what he's talking about when it comes to where we are in this country politically. Thank all of you for joining us here today, and we'll talk to you again soon. Thanks, Dan. Bye-bye.